Good day. Today is Thursday, 14th August 2025, and we are one day before the start of the meeting in Alaska, in Anchorage, at a US air base there, a military base there, the start of the meeting between President Putin of Russia and President Trump of the United States. And on the eve of this meeting, as is his way, President Putin of Russia convened a meeting in the Kremlin in which he discussed with key officials the preparations for this summit meeting. And the Kremlin website has provided us with details, with a brief, his brief opening statement, which I will read out in a moment. But we've also had information from Yuri Ushakov, further information from Yuri Ushakov about the structure of the meeting and in particular the makeup of the Russian delegation. And there's also been information provided by the Kremlin itself about the people who attended this meeting that Putin held today in the Kremlin in advance of the meeting tomorrow. Now, I think both the shape of the Russian delegation and the meeting in the Kremlin, the persons who attended the meeting in the Kremlin, tell us quite a lot. I think it's very interesting, and I will touch on that shortly. But let me first of all begin with Putin's words, with his words to the meeting in the Kremlin today. And this is what, according to the Kremlin, Putin said. These were his first words. I've asked you to gather today to brief you on the progress of negotiations regarding the Ukraine crisis and the bilateral talks with the Ukrainian delegation. Now that is already interesting because Putin is referencing the talks in Istanbul between the Russians and the Ukrainians. He still seems to consider these important. He still seems to approach this as a bilateral negotiation between Russia and Ukraine rather than Russia and the United States. And as we shall see in a moment, one of the people who were attending this meeting at which Putin said these words is Vladimir Medinsky, who is the head of the Russian delegation in Istanbul, and whose purpose would, of course, have been to brief the members of this meeting, the participants of this meeting, on the progress or lack of it at the meeting, the progress or lack of it in the various meetings which have taken place in Istanbul. And then Putin went on to say many of those present are already broadly aware of the situation, but I will provide more detailed information. This is the first matter. So, firstly, he's going to discuss the progress of the discussions in Istanbul, the bilateral discussions between Russia and Ukraine. And then he says this. Second, I will update you on the current stage of our engagement, and notice the word engagement, with the present US administration, which, as everyone knows, has been making what I consider to be fairly vigorous and sincere efforts to halt hostilities, resolve the crisis, and reach agreements that serve the interests of all parties involved in this conflict. The aim is to establish long-term conditions for peace, not only between our countries, but also in Europe and indeed globally, especially if we proceed to subsequent stages involving agreements on strategic offensive arms control. These are very interesting words, and let's just unpack them. So he says that the Russians, that he's going to update the members, the participants in the meeting, about the current stage of engagement with the present US administration. He talks here about engagement. When he talked about the Ukrainians, he was talking about negotiations. These are different words. Words have meaning, especially when they're used by a government as careful in its use of words and a leader as careful in his use of words as Putin. So the the negotiations to settle the conflict are between Russia and Ukraine, but Russia and the United States are also in discussion about the Ukrainian conflict. They're not negotiating about the Ukrainian conflict with each other, because it is the Ukrainians and the Russians who are conducting the negotiations. They are engaging with each other. They're perhaps bouncing ideas off each other. And Putin talks about the Americans, at least this administration, Trump himself, making vigorous and sincere efforts to halt hostilities, resolve the crisis, and reach agreements that serve the interests of all parties involved in this conflict, the aim being to establish long-term conditions for peace, not only between our countries, but also in Europe and indeed globally. Now let's unpack that very long, rather complicated sentence, because again, it is an interesting one. So the Americans are trying to end the conflict, but they're also trying to resolve the crisis. In other words, efforts are being made to resolve the larger crisis, and of course Putin, in many previous commentaries, has talked about the root causes of the crisis, and these have to be addressed in order for the crisis to be resolved. And he says that the Americans are making sincere and vigorous efforts to address these issues, which seems to me to be in line with the points made by my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on his channel, and which we've discussed together, and with the US Attorney Robert Barnes on our program, that the Americans are making the first real efforts to start to move forward towards perhaps Istanbul Plus, towards resolving the crisis by addressing its root causes. And that, according to Putin, would be in the interest of all the parties, but the aim is to establish long-term conditions for peace, not only between our countries. And which countries does he mean? Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the United States, perhaps both, but also in Europe. So that sort of implies that there's been discussions about perhaps the long-term security structure in Europe, that there's been some discussions about this, though obviously these have not been taken very far. That, of course, brings us to the question of the eastward expansion of NATO, which the Russians see as the root cause of the entire crisis, the crisis and the conflict in Ukraine, and the crisis in Europe, and also notice that Putin talks about long-term conditions for peace. The Russians have always said that they're not interested in a freezing of the conflict, a temporary suspension of the conflict. They're looking for long-term peace in Europe, a final, definitive resolution of the conflict in Ukraine, and ultimately in Europe also. And then he says that if this happens, it would have a positive effect, not just in the situation in Europe, because there would be peace, at least a final establishment, a true, genuine establishment of peace in Europe, with all the concerns, the issues about NATO expansion finally sorted out and resolved, but the Americans and the Russians would then be able to move forward to reach agreements regarding strategic offensive arms control. The Americans and the Russians would finally be able to return to arms control, what they were able to work with throughout the Cold War, and indeed continue to work with after the Cold War ended, and which I've discussed many times, expressing my concerns that the whole system of arms control, painstakingly negotiated by the Americans and the Russians during the Cold War, and afterwards, that whole system of arms control currently is hanging by a thread and is likely to collapse, is at risk of complete collapse. Well, very interesting words by Putin. As I said, very carefully chosen. They're chosen so as not to create problems for Trump ahead of the summit meeting. So Putin is being careful to keep his language as restrained as possible. But the meaning of what he says, it seems to me, is clear enough. Now, where Putin has been careful in his choice of words, the Russian Foreign Ministry has been rather more straightforward. So the Russian Foreign Ministry yesterday said that Russia will not make territorial concessions in Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. The territorial structure of Russia is enshrined in the country's constitution. So the Russians are in no mood, and they're not going to make any concessions on their claims to the four regions. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman spoke at considerable length yesterday, and he made it fairly clear, from what I could see, that the Russians are standing by all of their other demands. He mentioned NATO and said that the eastward expansion of NATO was the ultimate cause of the crisis. He said that the facts, the events of the last couple of weeks, again underscored the importance of denuclearization and denazification in Ukraine, and he reiterated that all of the objectives of the special military operation would be achieved. And he said those last things earlier today, even probably as Putin was meeting with these officials in the Kremlin. And as I said, it was yesterday that the Russian Foreign Ministry said that Russia will not make territorial concessions in Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson and Zaporozhye region. That seems to me intended to make clear that even as the Ukrainians are rejecting the ideas of land swaps, the Russians are not going to concede any territory in any one of these four regions either. We'll come to all of that shortly. So, from the look of all of this, Putin, the Russians are coming to this meeting in Alaska without intending to make any fundamental concessions on the Ukraine crisis at all. And I've said that was my expectation. As I said, these words from Putin and from the Foreign Ministry tend to reinforce them. And frankly, I would be surprised if we saw any big changes or concessions from the Russians in Anchorage, in Alaska, tomorrow. But now I want to move on to what I think is even more interesting, which is the makeup of the delegations and of the Russian delegation, and also of the people who attended this briefing that Putin has given about the Russian preparations for the summit meeting with Trump tomorrow. And this is the list of people who were at the meeting in the Kremlin today. So firstly, there was Putin's secretary, Anton Vaino, who is the head of the presidential administration. Medvedev, he was there. Shoigu was there. Manturov, who is the person who's overall charge of the Russian economy, he was there too. Other officials who are members of the presidential administration, Putin's own secretariat, Gromov, Kirienko. Kirienko has previously been in charge of the nuclear power industry. Novak, who was in charge of the oil and energy industries, he was there too. Oreshkin, who is Putin's chief economic advisor. Peskov, who is Putin's chief spokesman. Medinsky. Now, I've already mentioned Medinsky. As I said, he was there clearly to brief the other participants in the meeting of the interactions between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Istanbul. Ushakov, well, obviously he's there. Belousov, the defense minister. Lavrov, the foreign minister. Siluanov, the finance minister. Nabulina, the head of the central bank. Then the people from the intelligence and security services. Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, Russia's counterintelligence agency, which is also running intelligence operations in Ukraine. The FSB has overall responsibility within the Russian intelligence community for Ukraine. Narishkin, who is the head of Russia's foreign intelligence agency, its equivalent to the CIA. Zolotov, who's in charge of the Rosgvardia organization, the internal security forces of Russia. Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow. Dmitriev, Witkoff's friend and most important interlocutor, the head of the Direct Investment Fund, Russia's Direct Investment Fund, and then Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff. Now, one thing immediately struck me about the lineup of people at this meeting. Gerasimov was the only military man attending it, and clearly his purpose was to brief the meeting about the latest military developments on the front lines. Now, no other military official attended the meeting. Belousov, who's the defense minister, attended the meeting, but he is a civilian. He is not a military officer. The only military officer who attended the meeting was Gerasimov. And now we go to what Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy aide, said about the meeting in Alaska. And he's provided us with some details. He said it will start at 11:30 local time tomorrow. It will start with a one-to-one meeting between Putin and Trump, though there will, of course, be interpreters there. Then there will be meetings in the delegation format, which will extend into a working breakfast. And then after that, apparently, Putin and Trump will hold a press conference, apparently a short press conference. Doesn't look as if this meeting is going to continue for very long. But then Ushakov provided us with details of who is going to attend the meeting with Putin on the Russian side. So Lavrov, the foreign minister, Ushakov himself, Belousov, the defense minister, Siluanov, the finance minister, Dmitriev, the head of the investment in economic cooperation with foreign countries, the direct investment fund, Witkoff's friend. Notice not a single military official will be present at the meeting. So, my conclusions from this is that the Russians are not going to discuss military matters with the Americans. They're not going to talk about ceasefires, freezes of the conflict, retreats, advances, Ukrainian retreats from Donbass. They're not going to talk about any one of those things. If the Kremlin, if Putin was minded to discuss those things, if he was intending to get into those sort of details with Trump tomorrow, then he would have brought a military official with him, probably Gerasimov himself. But he has chosen not to bring any military officials with him, and that tells me that all the speculations about ceasefires, truces, freezes of the conflict, Ukrainian retreats from Donetsk, those kind of things, ceasefires in the fighting in the sky, those kind of things, they're not going to be discussed by Putin and Trump tomorrow, or at least the Russians don't expect them to be. Instead, we've had a meeting in Moscow in which civilian officials, mostly involved with the Russian economy, participated. So we had Manturov, Novak, Oreshkin, all members of Putin's secretariat, but also Nabulina, the head of the central bank, Siluanov, the finance minister. They were there. They were briefed at the meeting today in the Kremlin, and Siluanov, the finance minister, and Dmitriev, the head of the direct investment fund, they're coming with Putin to Alaska tomorrow. No military officers, but the finance minister and the head of Russia's direct investment fund will be coming to the meeting in Alaska tomorrow. So it seems to me that what is going to happen tomorrow is that Putin and Trump obviously are going to talk about Ukraine. I mean, they have to. They have no choice about it. But they will also start to talk or engage about future economic cooperation, about sanctions, the ending of sanctions, the resumption of trade, about investments by the US, by US businesses in the Russian economy, about all of those sort of things. That is why you would bring somebody like Siluanov, the finance minister, and Dmitriev, the head of the direct investment fund, to this sort of meeting. In other words, Putin believes and assumes that Trump expects the conflict in Ukraine, one way or the other, to end soon, and that once the conflict is out of the way, the Americans and the Russians are preparing to work together to develop economic contacts and links with each other, to move forward with agreements about economics, about trade, about finance, about that sort of thing. So that's how Putin sees this. And as for the actual details of the negotiations, the mechanics of the details of the negotiations about ending the conflict itself, well, the venue for that is not going to be the meeting tomorrow between Trump and Putin, though they will no doubt talk about those things, but the continued process in Istanbul. The meetings in Istanbul the meetings between Medinsky and Umerov, between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations. The Russians will be hoping that over the course of this meeting tomorrow, the Americans will go away and will tell the Ukrainians to start moving forward and making proposals, serious counter proposals to the Russians, so that the war can be ended and that the Americans can get on with negotiations with the Russians about all of the various things that I've discussed. Now, I don't think that this is over-analysing this information that's come from the Kremlin today. If we ever do get to a situation where military aspects are discussed between the Americans and the Russians, then we will see the military turn up. And as I discussed previously in earlier programs, the Russians have indeed sent high-level military officials to join their negotiating team in Istanbul. And before the last meeting in Istanbul, the military were fully briefed about the discussions that were taking place. There was a big meeting at which all of the leaders, all the military commanders in the SMO participated and were given an opportunity to discuss the negotiations and the way forward. So, two separate but parallel tracks. At least this is how the Russians envisage it. A discussion with the Ukrainians about ending the conflict, with the Americans perhaps giving the Ukrainians long-term advice on how they should conduct the negotiations from now, and simultaneously discussions between the Americans and the Russians about how they're going to improve their relationship, with a long-term objective to return to negotiations about arms control. Very interesting meeting in Moscow. Obviously, we don't have full details, but I think we can start to see the shape of what's going to happen at the meeting tomorrow. Anyway, I will be interested to see if I'm right. Obviously, if I'm not, then we will discuss it in my next program. And in the meantime, we will see how things do in fact turn out. Now, this is the meeting that's taken place in Moscow today. This is the makeup of the Russian delegation. Another meeting took place yesterday, a meeting between Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and the Europeans. And this has been one of the most astonishing, one of the most incredible meetings that I can ever remember. One which, well, as the news trickled out about it, and I should stress that we're getting a huge amount of misdirection about this meeting. All kinds of contradictory and inconsistent things have been said about it, and I suspect some things have been said which are probably untrue or perhaps go beyond what was actually said. Anyway, the more I heard about it, the more incredulous and horrified I was, because it was clear that at this meeting, which of course Zelensky attended, and where Friedrich Merz was apparently Trump's most important interlocutor, the Europeans, the vassals, if you like, took it upon themselves to tell their master, the President of the United States, how he should conduct negotiations with the Russians. And they told him that he should demand of the Russians a settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, which in pretty much every respect, is worse than the settlement that the victorious Allies dictated to Germany at Versailles in 1919. This at a time when the Russians, as everybody can see, and hardly anyone any longer denies, are winning the war. In fact, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has actually said straightforwardly that the Russians have won the war, Europe has lost, and the Europeans need to understand that fact. Well, not only do they not understand it, they make unbelievable, incredible demands. They want Ukraine they want the conflict to end with a ceasefire on the existing conflict lines. They want security guarantees for Ukraine, which ultimately must include NATO membership. They want the Russians to pay up to $1 trillion in compensation to Ukraine for the conflict. They want, Ukraine's unrestricted right to build up its armed forces to whatever level it chooses. They want Ukraine and Ukraine alone to decide on its territory and on its security and all of that. That's perhaps the one part of the demands which makes a certain sense. But anyway, in all other respects, they're behaving as if they are in a position to dictate the peace to the Russians, who are, however, about to win the war. It is difficult to understand the logic of all of this. And I really do wonder what deep down Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who was also in on the call, what they made of it all. Well, according to Zelensky, according to some of the people in Europe, Trump allegedly said that he accepted that Ukraine should be granted some security guarantees. By the way, the Russians have also said that Ukraine and Russia also should be granted security guarantees. But I doubt actually that Trump said very much about this. And I think that Zelensky is probably going beyond the meaning of what Trump said. The Europeans are trying to insinuate that Trump agreed that European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine should be granted some kind of backstop or guarantee by the Americans. I don't believe that Trump said that. After all, he has categorically rejected it in the past. Why would he agree to it now? Just saying. So you can see European and Ukrainian leaders trying to put words into Trump's mouth, perhaps misrepresenting things he did actually say, in order to make it appear that he made commitments, which it would be illogical to assume that he actually did, and which would be meaningless anyway, given that Putin himself would have to agree to them. Trump left the meeting. He obviously wanted to be as conciliatory as possible. But he, when asked what would happen if there was no ceasefire agreed by the Russians, he said that there would be very grave consequences for the Russians. But I noticed that he was very careful not to spell out what those consequences were. And when he was asked about sanctions and tariffs, he evaded giving an answer. So that was the European approach to the meeting. Now, we've received further news over the last couple of hours, and it seems that Trump did put his foot down in one respect. I think it was Politico that confirmed that the Europeans again pressed Trump to allow Zelensky to go to Alaska and to be present at the meeting. And they not only asked for Zelensky to go to Alaska, but they wanted Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, to go to Alaska as well. It's not clear to me whether they wanted Zelensky to actually participate in the discussions with Putin, or whether they simply wanted Zelensky and Rutte to be physically present so that Trump would speak to them directly after the meeting, where presumably they would work to erase whatever good impression Putin made on Trump. I mean, that would be the purpose. As I said, I don't know whether Zelensky and Rutte were intended to join the meeting. But anyway, Trump said categorically no. And apparently he made it clear that he feared that if Zelensky especially were present at the meeting in Alaska, then he would be a disruptive influence. And for that reason, Trump didn't want him there. Now, bear in mind that just a few days ago, Trump himself was talking about having a three-party meeting of himself, Putin, and Zelensky. Now we're told in the American media that Trump himself has come to the view that Zelensky should not be present in Alaska because he would be disruptive. So anyway, the most important thing, in my opinion, that came out of the meeting yesterday was not that the Europeans made these ridiculous demands, which they then told the President of the United States. Told, I think, is the correct word. They didn't ask him. They told the President of the United States to make to the Russians. The most important thing that came out of the meeting yesterday is that Trump finally put his foot down and told the Europeans and the Ukrainians, you're not wanted in Alaska. This is a bilateral discussion between the United States and Russia. You're not wanted there. You don't belong there. Please stay away. As I said, he tried to sugar the pill, or so it seems to me, a little later, but that's what he appears to have said. Well, that's what apparently he did say. So there is an extraordinary meeting. Now, I've already expressed my own horror at the approach that the Europeans are taking. They must know that Ukraine is losing the war. They must know that military arsenals across the collective West are depleting. They must know that Russia is producing 4 times more weapons in any year than they are. They must know that the Russian army is advancing in Ukraine. They must know that Brazil, India, and China have said no to the various threats of tariffs and sanctions, which the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and, by the way, the Americans too, have threatened them with. So, despite all of that, the Europeans make these outrageous demands, not directly to the Russians, but to the President of the United States. So what is the purpose of this? Well, I don't think it's difficult, and Alex Christoforou and I discussed it in a recent program, in a program which we've just done, which will shortly be coming out on the Duran. Is clearly to wreck the negotiations in Alaska, to make sure that they would be stillborn, to get the Americans to make demands of the Russians, which the Russians would be bound to refuse, and which would end the entire process of Russian-American, well, I won't say rapprochement, but dialogue, and which would continue the war. Continue the war indefinitely, apparently, until what happens? Kiev falls, Ukraine is destroyed. I mean, let's say the Russians reach Kiev. Let's say the Russians capture Kiev. Will the Europeans still continue making these same demands? If the Russians reach Lvov, will they continue to make these same demands then? Surely the right thing to do is to do everything possible, at least the right thing to do from a European point of view, would be to do everything possible to prevent the Russians from taking control of Kiev or Lvov. But we see that the Europeans are doing the opposite. And it bears repeating again that it is Ukrainians who are paying the price of this. It is Ukrainians who are dying every day on the Ukrainian battlefronts. It is Ukrainians in the civilian sector whose lives become more difficult every day. It is Ukraine which every day loses territory and population. And yet we see that the Europeans will concede nothing. They will not scale down their demands in the face of these realities. And the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, the person who has responsibilities for Ukraine, he goes along with all of this. In fact, he demands it. I've said already in many programs that it has long seemed to me that Zelensky's objective is not to end the war, but to remain president of Ukraine and to keep the flow of aid and assistance and money to Ukraine continuing until the moment of final collapse, so that he can leave Ukraine and establish himself in some European capital as the president, leader of a government in exile. I appreciate that this is my view. Zelensky himself has never said anything like this. He wouldn't. But was there anything in his conduct yesterday that argued for a different conclusion? If so, I don't see it. And of course, Zelensky insists that all of the talk about Russian breakthroughs, about Russian advances, about the Russians not being susceptible to sanctions, all of that apparently is a bluff. We shouldn't pay any attention to it. The fact that sanctions have been attempted not for 3 years, but for 11 and have failed. The fact that all of those weapons that Ukraine has received have changed nothing on the battlefields. Well, they have changed things on the battlefields. They've prolonged the war, but entirely to Ukraine's disadvantage. Should we learn anything from that? Well, of course not. We should just go on doing the same thing as before. Give Ukraine, or to be more precise, him, more money, more weapons, more diplomatic support, more meetings with Western and European leaders, so that when he comes to the West and sets himself up as the leader in exile of Ukraine, he not only has the resources that go with that, but also the support from Europe, from the European capitals that comes with it. And what does he do immediately after this meeting, this virtual meeting, which he attended in Berlin? By the way, many people commented on how dreadful Zelensky looked in the pictures that were released over the course of this meeting. I'm not going to explore that further. You can all draw your own conclusions. Anyway, what does he do? Does he go back to Kiev? Does he take charge of the situation there as the military crisis on the battlefields deepens? Does he get on the phone to the President of the United States? Well, of course, he's been speaking to the President of the United States rather a lot, rather too much, actually. Does he send his foreign minister to Washington? Does he take any steps at all in that direction? No. He flies to London, where he meets again his dear friend, Sir Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of Great Britain. And lo and behold, I've seen pictures already appearing of the two of them outside Downing Street. And maybe it's not quite an embrace again as it was before, though for all I know there was such an embrace. But at least they're hugging, and again they appear the best of friends. Keir Starmer, anxious to bring the Zelensky curse down on himself. He can't say no to Zelensky, and Zelensky is there. And what exactly he expects Starmer to do at this time to help him and to help Ukraine, I have no idea. But it's interesting how under pressure it is to London and to Starmer that Zelensky invariably goes. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that meeting in Berlin. I'm going to make one further point about it, actually, before I move on. And that is that, as anybody who's been following these programs and has been listening to us on the Duran over the 7 years that we've been running this channel will know, I have developed a very, very low opinion of the quality of political leadership in Europe. About them, I have always set my expectations very low. But truth to say, however low I set my expectations of them, they always seem to sink below even my lowest expectations. But they have never fallen as low, in my opinion, as they did yesterday. The arrogance, the sense of entitlement, the moralizing, the hypocrisy, the cynicism on display in this video conference with Trump and Vance yesterday surpasses all records. All I will say is, well, moral and political bankruptcy in Europe is now there for everyone to see. What people outside Europe make of it, I don't want to think. Anyway, that was the meeting yesterday. Those are the clues that we have about the meeting tomorrow. A relatively short meeting, it seems. A meeting where the two intend to get to know each other. The fact that they are intending to hold a joint press conference suggests, by the way, that they do have already some understandings of how to move forward between them. We will see what comes. I will discuss it all tomorrow. Well, I will discuss it when we have more news, and we will see what happens. Anyway, in the meantime, the war itself goes on, and there's been a lot of information from the battlefronts, from the area of Mercouris, but I ought to say that it is information that, though in some respects it continues to be very vague, I mean, there is still great uncertainty as to who controls what exact position. gradually, the more we learn about it, the more it stacks up that we have a massive crisis facing Ukraine in northeast of Pokrovsk, and that the Russians have indeed taken control of most, or indeed perhaps even all, of the territory that reports and rumours over the last couple of days claimed that they had. Now, over the last couple of days, there's been a lot of reports about how the Ukrainians have been rushing reinforcements to this area, and the two military units that are most talked about are the 12th Azov Brigade and the 79th Airborne Division. Now, the 12th Azov Brigade I have already talked about. I don't think it is of the standard and level of training of the original 3rd Azov Brigade, but I'm not going to discuss that. The 79th Airborne Division had just been taken out of the front lines to be given an opportunity to rest and refit. There is apparently widespread sickness in its ranks, and the division's website or blog has been talking about a spread of sexually transmitted diseases amongst several of the soldiers. I'm not going to discuss that in detail, but this information does come from the division itself. They are absolutely furious about the fact that they have been taken out of rest after just 2 days and are being rushed to try to contain the crisis in Pokrovsk. And one has to wonder whether soldiers in this sort of mood, or indeed in this sort of condition, are going to be up to fighting successfully against the Russians, who obviously have momentum and who are there in huge numbers on the battlefronts, on this particular battlefront. And when I talk about huge numbers, perhaps it's worth adding that the force, 2 brigades apparently, that the Ukrainians are now rushing to the area, well, assuming these 2 brigades are up to strength, which by the way they probably aren't, I'm guessing the 12th Azov Brigade mostly is, but it doesn't seem likely that the 79th Airborne Division Brigade is. Anyway, we are perhaps talking about a force of between 5,000 and 10,000 men. This in an area where the Russian army is said to have 110,000 men concentrated. So what is this force going to do exactly? Well, there's lots of rumours and speculations. This morning, reports began to circulate in the various Telegram channels. I should make it clear that I don't consider these reports to be particularly, to be in fact at all reliable, but reports circulated that this force that the Ukrainians have rushed to the area did indeed carry out a counterattack, or at least attempted some kind of a counterattack, but allegedly, supposedly, the counterattack was completely unsuccessful. I mean, it may be true, it may not be true, who knows? And the reports say that the Russians are indeed in control of the various places that they're supposed to have captured. Zoloty Kolodyaz, Rubizhne, Vilny, Norivka, a bit to the south, Pankivka, and that they have encircled another village in this area, Kucherev Yar, and that they are advancing towards two other villages in this area, Toretskoye and Shakhove, which they need to capture, and that they've also advanced into another village. This is villages to the east of all of these positions, between this breakthrough area and the town of Konstantinovka, that there's now fighting underway for control of another village called Volodymyrivka. And the point is that Volodymyrivka, Shavkovke, Toretskoye, Sofivka, another village in this area, and Kucherev Yar itself, if the Russians are able to capture them, then they will have consolidated their gains and they will have achieved operational depth in their breakthrough area, and it will be much more difficult for the Ukrainians to mount any sort of successful counterattacks in order to break through, to break the Russian positions and to reverse the breakthrough that the Russians have carried out over the last couple of days. Now, Radovka, the Russian newspaper located in Smolensk, which is the newspaper that has provided a lot of information about this Russian breakthrough, and which up to now has been mostly true about the things it has been reporting. Anyway, Radovka is now saying that there is intense fighting going on, that the west of Rodinske, west of the road, the supply road leading into Pokrovsk, upon which Rodinske and Bilitske are located, that the Russians are indeed fighting in this village of Shevchenko, southwest of Dobropilie, and that they have indeed moved to occupy other positions, another village called, I believe it was Novo Alexandrovka, in this area, and that they are advancing towards Grishino, the village just to the north of the key E50 highway. And if this is correct, then it could be that there are two Russian advances simultaneously towards this highway. One from the north, heading towards Grishine, from forces that have broken through between Rodinske and Bilitske and have reached Shevchenko and are pressing southwards towards Grishine, and one from the south, because the Russians, and it seems now that this is confirmed, are now not only in control of Udachnye, but having captured Udachnye, they're advancing northward from Udachnye and Kotlino. Kotlino was a village they captured at the end of last year in this same general area, and that they are advancing towards a mine which is located between these two villages, Udachnye, Kotlino, and the E50 road. And if they capture this mine, then they will have effective control over the road. So if the Russians capture Grishine, and capture this mine, they will in effect have cut the road. And they will have cut all the supply roads, all the big supply roads to Pokrovsk, and they will have cut all the access and escape points leading into and out of Pokrovsk. I want to make this clear that, again, this is all from Radovka. There's been no visual confirmation of this. There's been no video footage yet. So this may be true or it may not be true. But as I said, Radovka has generally been correct about these things. As I said, if Rodinske, the Russians are supposed to be now in control of something like 40% of Rodinske. And just early this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry said that a village called Krasno Liman, which is located just to the south of Rodinske, has now fallen and is now fully under Russian control, which also points to the Russians being soon in a position to capture Rodinsky. Anyway, if Rodinsky, Shevchenko, Grishiny are all captured, and the Russians advancing from the south, from Kotlino, Udachny, capture this coal mine, then the entire garrison in Pokrovsk is surrounded. And unless the Ukrainians are able to break through, unless the Ukrainians are able to mount a counterattack to pierce through this ring that the Russians are creating, then we have a cauldron, the first cauldron on this scale since the cauldron that we saw in Mariupol in the early summer of 2022. It would be a major operational crisis. I discussed this in my program yesterday, but Radovka is talking about it being hours or perhaps at most days before the cauldron is fully shut. Now, well, we will see what the Ukrainians do if we have a crisis like that. If the Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk are indeed encircled in that kind of way, then, as I said already, we would have a defeat, a potential defeat for the Ukrainians, similar in quality to the ones the Ukrainians suffered in 2014 in the Battle of Ilovaisk and in 2015 in the Battle of Debaltsevo, but on a much bigger scale and at a much more critical point in the conflict. I suspect that if we see a collapse, an encirclement and a mass surrender in Debaltsevo, the effect, the psychological effect will be enormous, and it will create a crisis for the Ukrainians right across the whole battlefronts and might hasten the collapse that we are likely to see anyway before long, at least in Donbass and perhaps in eastern Ukraine taken as a whole. Now, another reason to think that things are going catastrophically wrong for Ukraine is because the Daily Telegraph in London, a newspaper which, as I've said, seems to me to be very closely connected to the British Defence Ministry. It's an impression, but that's certainly my impression. The Daily Telegraph, a newspaper which has been consistently pumping out stories, pro-Ukrainian stories throughout the war, projecting impressions that Ukraine is winning, that the Russians are failing. Anyway, it has just published the most pessimistic article about Ukraine and its prospects in the war that it has ever published. And the title itself is extremely revealing. Why divided Ukrainians are refusing to fight for Zelensky. Russian gains in the east are undermining morale while casting Kiev's manpower problems in stark relief. Now notice the title, Divided Ukrainians. Up to now, until very recently, the Telegraph and much of the British media were projecting an image of Ukraine united in its determination to defeat and resist Russia. Now we are told that the Ukrainians are divided. And notice that they are divided, but they're also refusing to fight for, not Ukraine, not for Ukraine's independence, but for Zelensky. The title now speaks of the Ukrainians fighting for Zelensky as opposed to Ukraine. That is already suggestive, and it is already critical about the whole situation in Ukraine. And then we have a long description, a long, detailed account of the manpower crisis in the Ukrainian army and the unwillingness of the Ukrainians to fight. And we're told, we have an interview with a Ukrainian man, Pavlo, who we're told is not a conscientious objector. He regards himself as a patriot. He never questions the righteousness of Ukraine's cause. But he, and we're told by the Telegraph, millions like him don't want to fight. And we're told that the reluctance to serve and the ever-swelling number of deserters has long troubled Ukraine. We're told that the Ukrainians are so short of men that they're having to deploy some of their best reserves to slow the Russians. But Deep State, a monitoring group close to the defense ministry, this is a direct quote now, called the situation near Pokrovsk chaotic. We're told that even as the Ukrainians crumble, they're having to redeploy men who have already been fighting and brigades who have already been fighting constantly to try to hold back the Russians, and that this is exhausting them. We're told that the Russians are now deploying more drones and better countermeasures against Ukrainian drones, and we're told that the Ukrainian drones, are now becoming less and less effective. And anyway, we're told that the desertion crisis is stark, that the collapse in morale is feeding a vicious cycle. These are direct quotes. As ranks thin, generals strip other units to fill the front line. Air Force mechanics and radar operators are sent to fight as infantry where life expectancy is far shorter. This in turn makes evaders even more determined to stay alive. And we're told that impressions in cities are misleading, even though the cities Kiev, Lvov, even Kharkiv may look normal. In reality, the mood there is not normal at all. And then we have a direct quote. When you are losing, this is from a Ukrainian, and there is a manpower shortage, then obviously, if you're a Ukrainian male, your willingness to join up is far smaller than it was in 2022, when it looked as if Ukraine was winning and the Russians were being pushed back. Well, that's the Daily Telegraph. Fascinatingly, there is a long article by the blogger Big Serge discussing the military situation in Ukraine. Big Serge has been consistently one of the most interesting commentators about the war altogether. And, well, his article, which obviously looks at things from an entirely different perspective, mirrors almost exactly what the Daily Telegraph article is saying. They've come out on the same day and they say the same thing. One from an avowedly pro-Ukrainian perspective. The other, Big Serge, well, some people would call him pro-Russian. And Big Serge puts it like this. The title of his article, shorter perhaps more to the point than the Daily Telegraph article, scraping the barrel, attrition and cannibalization. And the Daily Telegraph talked about a vicious circle, Ukraine forcing men who are not trained infantry to fill the gaps left by the enormous shortages Ukraine is suffering in terms of its lack of infantry. And Dick says exactly the same thing, that they cannot make up their losses. When shortfalls mount like this, attrition becomes self-reinforcing and continues at an exponential rate. This in particular seems to be unappreciated by many. Attrition creates a positive feedback loop. It's almost the same as what the Telegraph is saying. And he talks about cannibalization of the tail. Infantry complements wear down without replacement. Individual formations are compelled to cannibalize their support personnel to fill out the front lines. Rear area personnel and artillerymen are sent forward to reinforce brigade infantry complements, and eventually this process spreads from individual brigades to the armed forces writ large. Replacing infantry ad hoc with personnel who are not trained for that purpose not only reduces the quality of the infantry, but cannibalizes, distorts and dismantles the structure of the army. Brigades gradually lose their suitability for the full range of combat tasks as they eat themselves for infantry. It's exactly what the Daily Telegraph has just said. He talks about increased wear due to lack of rotations. We've seen the 79th Brigade, Airborne Brigade, complaining about this, that they were taken out of the line for just 2 days to rest, only to be thrown back into the battle despite the sicknesses in their ranks, to try to close the holes that are appearing in Pokrovsk. Increasing desertions, rising rate of desertion. Well, the Telegraph talks about that too. The misallocation of premier assets, the best brigades constantly used to plug the gaps so that there is no ability to undertake strategic initiative any longer. Well, it's exactly the same analysis as the one that, as I said, the Daily Telegraph is now finally providing us with. But of course, for those who want to believe there is an explanation, I think it's the Wall Street Journal that has now published yet another article that says that Ukraine has reverted to Soviet-style tactics. It's because General Zelensky was sacked and General Syrskyi, with his Soviet background, has taken over, that is what is bringing about the crisis on the battlefields. This is delusional. It's not Soviet-style tactics. It is the result of 3.5 years of relentless attrition. And there is no way out of it. None at all. None. No way in which it can be reversed. And over the last couple of hours, other reports have also appeared. Now, there's been lots of speculations. There were lots of speculations in July that at the end of July, Ukraine was going to launch missile strikes against Russia. Missile strikes against the Russian capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I've discussed in many programs my own belief that the weapons that were going to be used to do it were going to be Taurus missiles, and that the Taurus missiles had already been provided by Germany, but they would be repackaged by the Germans and the Ukrainians, and they would be used instead to target Russian positions, including by launching missile strikes against these cities. Well, The FSB yesterday, the Russian counterintelligence agency, which, as I said, has overall charge of intelligence gathering for the Russians in Ukraine, now has corrected this information. It looks as if it was not Taurus missiles at all. It was the Sapsan missile, a missile that Ukraine was working on from well before the start of the conflict. Some people say that it was the Ukrainian equivalent of the Iskander, the Russian Iskander missile. It's a ballistic missile, not a cruise missile like the Taurus missile. Supposedly, the Ukrainians were getting financial and economic help from Germany to develop it. Factories had been created to produce it. These missiles were being stored in various warehouses across Ukraine. And then, of course, July ended. And as I think I mentioned in one of my programs, there were no actual Ukrainian missile strikes on Moscow and St. Petersburg. Nothing like that actually happened. And now the FSB gives us its account of why that was. The FSB says that they located where these missiles were being made, the factories that were supplying the explosives, the rocket fuel, the electronic components for these missiles, where the missiles were being housed, all of these things. And over the last few weeks, the Russians conducted the massive missile and drone strikes, the ones with the hundreds of Geran drones, and the missiles which I talked about at length in my previous programs. And according to the FSB, they wiped the entire Sapsan missile program out. They destroyed all of the missiles, all of the launchers, all of the facilities, the factories, the workshops that produced them. They were all completely destroyed. Now, again, I have no way of verifying this information, but bear in mind that the FSB probably would not be saying something like this if they feared that Sapsan missiles might indeed be launched at Russian cities tomorrow. So most likely this information is true. And if Zelensky and his people really did think that these missiles were the magic solution for Ukraine's problems in the war, well, it looks as if that magic solution, those miracle weapons, have been stripped away. Just a few weeks ago, there were reports about a telephone conversation between Donald Trump and Zelensky on the 4th of July, in which Trump supposedly asked Zelensky, why haven't you launched missiles against Russia yet? And Zelensky said, we would do so if we were provided with the missiles, and just give us a few tomahawks and we can get it done. Something which, of course, Trump refused to do, and he apparently refused to supply the JASSMs missiles that Ukraine wanted to also, or at least that was what Trump himself said. I wonder whether, in light of this information from the FSB, that discussion was about the Sapsan program. The Americans must have known about it, and it could be that the Ukrainians have been telling the Americans and the Germans and everybody, hold out, don't give up, go ahead and impose the massive sanctions on the Russians, because we're soon going to turn the tide. Our missiles will be striking targets in Moscow and St. Petersburg. You won't be directly implicated because these are our missiles, and as soon as that happens, you will see the Russians will cave. They will start to talk. And could it be that after a very difficult conversation with Putin on the 3rd of July, and very angry Donald Trump spoke to Zelensky on the 4th of July and asked him, well, I've been hearing all about these missiles that you're going to launch against the Russians, your SAP-SANs and all that. Why haven't you done it yet? When are you going to do it? And Zelensky said, don't worry, we're almost ready. We are going to do it very soon. And then, of course, the Russians destroy all of these missiles. They destroy the entire program. Could this be just possibly another reason why, on top of all of the other reasons, the crisis in Pokrovsk, the refusal of the Indians, the Chinese to stop buying Russian oil, the depletion of America's own arsenals, could this be a further reason why Donald Trump decided there's really no choice? I have to sit and talk with Vladimir Putin now. He has the cards. I don't have the cards. If I simply sit back and do nothing, then Ukraine is going to lose and they're all going to blame me. All very speculative on my part. But anyway, you can see the pieces. And if you want to put them together in some other way, please feel free. But I have to say, that's a little bit how it looks to me. Anyway, this is the situation ahead of the meeting between Putin and Trump tomorrow. Now, if the SAP-SAN program has been destroyed, this, together with everything else that we know, how is it that the Europeans continue to insist that the President of the United States makes these ludicrous demands of Vladimir Putin when they meet in Alaska tomorrow? Do these people understand what they're doing? If they do, then shame on them. Not that shame is a quality, perhaps, that they care about very much. For the rest, I set out at the start of the program my views about how the Russians are preparing for the summit tomorrow. It seems to me that the summit itself, the fact that it is taking place at all, is probably a sign that, at least in America, they realize that Russia has won the war. And that, for that reason, it has to be ended. Anyway, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work on Patreon and Subscribestar you can find the links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel.